I have forgotten to do that before. All right, and muting everybody. Of course, besides Paul, feel free to unmute yourself. All right, everyone, we're gonna get started. Thank you all so much for being here for the visual context of Benjamin Franklin. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Abby King, the Assistant Director of Adult Programs here at PAFA. And I want to start today by, I think how I've started almost every program we've had, with a huge thank you to all of the PAFA members who are on this call. Thank you all so much for being here and supporting us today and every day. If you haven't already, please consider joining. I'll drop a link to that in the chat. And thanks to everybody, regardless of membership, who are here with us. It's so nice to see all 72 of you so far on the call. I do, of course, for most of all these events, I do just a quick Zoom run through. I know many of us have done this what feels like hundreds of times at this point, but just so we're all on the same page. As you can tell, I went ahead and muted everyone. I am going to ask you to stay muted for the duration of this call. That's because Zoom likes to assume that it knows who the speaker is. So Paul or Dr. Sivitz might be speaking and a cat will come in on the call, and instead we're gonna think that the cat is our Benjamin Franklin scholar, when it's not. So just out of respect for our speaker and for me today, please stay muted. That's not to say that we don't want to hear from you. We definitely do. So I'm going to ask that during the duration of the talk, if you want to put questions, thoughts, links in the chat, and I'm going to get that started here and drop that development link that I mentioned as well, or membership link, excuse me. We are going to have time for a question and answer. So you can put questions in the chat and we'll get to them as we go. We'll also open it up that way at the very end. We do have the option if you'd like to virtually raise your hand. So during the Q&A portion, if you'd like to, rather than type your question, ask your question, you can raise your hand by clicking on where it says the participant button at the bottom of your screen. And on the right-hand side, it'll pop up and say raise hand. So that is an option, but you can also always just put things in the chat. Other quick things to mention is that we are recording today's program. We've recorded almost all of our programs and we share them on our YouTube channel, which I'll put the link to that in the chat as well if you'd like to check out our archive of programs. But that's just to mention, if you'd like to not be on the recording, you can mute your camera button at the bottom of your screen. I will say the majority of the recording is going to be just of our speaker today, just in case you know that you have that option as well. The other thing is I would recommend that you pin our speaker. So I'm gonna have Paul just say hi for a second so everyone can see him.
Hi, hello, hello. Thanks for coming today, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So everybody sees our speaker. So if you want to go on his square where there's 3 little dots, you wanna click the drop-down menu where it says pin video. You can do that. That way he will be the image that you see throughout the whole presentation. You can also make sure that you're in speaker mode, which is in the upper right-hand corner, so he'll be the big square on your screen when we share. Other than that, it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker. We have scholar Dr. Paul Sivitz here with us. I did want to mention too is that this is a preview of sorts for a class that Paul is teaching for PAFA starting next week, which is called Picturing Benjamin Franklin. I'm going to put a link to that if you're interested and want to hear more after this, but I did of course want to put in that plug for Paul's class.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And just a bit about our speaker. So Dr. Paul Sivitz has returned to his native Philadelphia after retiring from the Department of History of Idaho State University. He specializes in early America, race and slavery, and the circulation of knowledge in the 18th century. He's the co-director of the Digital Humanities Project, Mapping Historic Philadelphia. And one of the project maps free African-American households in Philadelphia, 1789 to 1791, is on permanent display at the National Museum of African-American History and Culture. So please join me everyone today in welcoming our scholar. Thank you so much for being here with us. I'll turn it over
Thank you. Thanks, Abby. Let's get started. Whoops, wait a minute. I missed a button. What happened to my share screen button? Here it is. Cleverly hidden. Okay, now we're there. Okay. So I hope you can all see this wonderful, very pertinent image of Benjamin Franklin. And today what I want to talk about is our visual perceptions of Franklin, but putting those perceptions in an historical context. Franklin, our idea of Franklin is the image of Franklin on the $100 bill, not necessarily wearing the COVID mask, but more likely the image that is derived from this particular painting from about 1785, about 5 years before Franklin's death. This is the image of Franklin that we tend to picture, the old, somewhat corpulent Benjamin Franklin, very wise looking. But this is not the image of Franklin that we should really see, because for most of his life, he didn't look anything like this in terms of this kind of heavy-set, grizzled-looking guy who looks relatively unhappy right here. He was not that type of person. One thing you should know about Benjamin Franklin from the very outset is Benjamin Franklin's favorite subject was Benjamin Franklin. He was one of the best self-promoters of all time. And this is one of the things that puts us in a bit of conflict, because we think of Franklin in lots of sorts of ways. But what I want you to do is when you think about Franklin, I want you to think about this Benjamin Franklin, about 18, 19 years earlier than the previous portrait, the portrait from the $100 bill. This is Franklin in his mid-60s, after he has achieved essentially worldwide fame and notoriety. And he was the first international superstar in the truest sense of the word. He was not famous for being famous. He was famous for doing stuff. And this is Franklin after much of the hoopla surrounding Franklin has settled down. He's pictured here engrossed in study. He's clearly involved with two different things: reading, literacy, and science. That bust you see in the background is Sir Isaac Newton. Now, this portrait of Franklin is held by PAFA, and I don't think it's on display right now, not that you can actually go and see it, but it is hung much of the time. I've seen it there many, many times, but I'm not sure that the last time I was at PAFA it was actually on display. Now, as we think about everything today, I want you to think about these two big questions. Why is Franklin so important? And there are answers that are more obvious than others. And the other question, which can lead to some rather uncomfortable discussions in some circles, is how he is the same or different than the other people we refer to as the founding fathers. Not necessarily my favorite phrase, but I'm using it here because it's one that everybody seems to understand in a certain sort of context. So here's a bigger image of the David Martin portrait from 1767. And Franklin here is clearly contemplative. He's not looking old and grizzled. Clearly, he's also posed because he's wearing much fancier clothes than he normally would, and he's got the powder in his hair and and all of that good stuff. So this is, of course, like many portraits, very artificial. But as for most famous sitters, they dictate what they want the artist to do. And here, Franklin is surrounded by the things, the objects that are most important in his life at this moment. One thing that's not here, really, is Franklin's connection to politics, which at this moment in 1767 is, Franklin has let out a sigh of relief right around this time, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But he's surrounded by books and papers and science. And let's start with the books and papers and literacy and education. These are the things that are most deeply connected to Benjamin Franklin. The stuff with science happens because of his connection to literacy and education. Now, I don't have time to talk about all of Franklin's connections to this topic. I mean, you can spend entire university courses talking about Franklin and still not even scratch the surface. So I'm just going to hit a few highlights. He founded the Library Company of Philadelphia in 1731. This is, in effect, the first public library, truly public library, in a high population area in the British colonies. Up until this point, the only large libraries were housed at two private universities, Harvard and Yale. And so this is a big step to open a library that is open, is available to everyone. Now, it was a subscription library. Not everybody was allowed to borrow books unless you paid a fee, which, of course, very important. There are still in existence some subscription libraries today where you have to pay to borrow books, but anyone was welcome to the library to go and read. Books were so expensive in Franklin's time that they were beyond the means of most individuals. So this was the big connection to literacy outside of periodicals that anyone could have. Franklin was already a printer when he founded the Pennsylvania Gazette newspaper that was enormously successful, huge. Franklin made newspapers accessible to loads and loads of people. First by shipping out the Gazette from Philadelphia and then opening satellite offices up and down the eastern seaboard. And this was a major source of Franklin's wealth, was the Pennsylvania Gazette, not from the sales of the newspaper itself necessarily, but from how newspapers derive much of their income, through advertising. And this is where we start to think about Franklin in relation to the other founding fathers. Like the other people we call the founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin owned slaves. Just two, maybe three. We know for sure two that he owned for quite a while. And they were part of his household for many, many years. Franklin, the slaveholder, was different than, let's say, Thomas Jefferson, the slaveholder, or George Washington, the slaveholder, to take two of the other people we normally consider founding fathers. Franklin's wealth was not dependent on his ownership of slaves, unlike Washington and Jefferson. Franklin's wealth, however, was dependent a lot on slavery. I mentioned the income he derived from advertising in his newspaper, and he had so much income from the advertising from his newspaper because one of the major sources of this advertising were runaway slave ads. And this brought in enormous amounts of money because runaway slave ads, by and large, were not tiny little snippets. They consumed significant page space because they often had an image, a drawing, or a woodcut, and a significant amount of text. So there was a lot of column inches devoted to these slave ads, and it was a huge source of income for Franklin. We know, and it's relatively common knowledge, that Franklin was an abolitionist. So how is everything that I'm saying possible? Franklin becomes an abolitionist. He becomes an abolitionist much later in life. And it has, his move toward abolition has to do with the education part of literacy and education. So I'll come back to that in just a second. Franklin, in 1737, was appointed postmaster of the northern colonies. This contributed to his wealth because, as postmaster, he could ship his newspapers for free. He didn't incur any shipping charges because he was in charge, and that was one of the perks. So, in essence, he had the overhead, the only overhead he had was printing. And this distribution allowed him to make lots of extra money. On top of that, and just touch on this for 1 second here, he also had secured loads of British government printing contracts. So he was making money hand over fist. At the same time all this is going on, he is deeply invested in education. The library company I already mentioned, and then in the late 1740s, he has an idea for a school that is not a religious-based school. He founds the Academy and College of Philadelphia, along with several other people. He writes this big proposal and founds this institution. Now, like many things in the 18th century, it was, of course, restricted to young men and boys. It was not coeducational in Franklin's time. This, as you can see, becomes the University of Pennsylvania. And his connection to education, as I said, leads him to join the abolitionist movement. Franklin visits a school where young African-American boys are being taught. And he has, we'll just call it what it is, he has an epiphany. Franklin always assumed, up until that point, that African-Americans were naturally much less intelligent than white people. He had assumed that. And when he went to this school and saw that people of color were just as capable of learning as whites, he almost immediately changed his tune. And he committed these ideas to paper. So we know he actually believed it. This is not apocryphal. And from that moment on, he becomes a force in the abolitionist movement. And one thing that's a bit connected to this, we connect Franklin oftentimes with the Quakers in Philadelphia, in particular, in Pennsylvania at large. Franklin himself was not a Quaker. He was born in Massachusetts as about the 253rd child in a very large Puritan family, actually the 17th. He was the youngest child of 17 in a large Puritan family. And Franklin's ideas about religion and organized religion and things like that is a whole other topic for another day. But Franklin does have a lot of links with the Quakers. By the time Franklin is a political and civic force in Philadelphia, Quakers have lost most of their political power. But culturally and ideologically, Franklin is in lockstep with them much of the time. Not all the time, but much of the time. And the Quakers had started their moves toward abolition in the mid-18th century, in the mid-1700s. And Franklin joins them in the late 1770s, and he becomes part of this movement. So, just to alleviate any confusion for those of you who are from out of town, Penn is different than Penn State. I added this slide because I think when people say, oh, Ben Franklin founded Penn State. No, he did not. He founded the University of Pennsylvania. They are two different entities. So just to clear up any confusion, we have this slide for you. Now, that David Martin portrait really connects to Franklin and science and technology, which were the same. They were considered the same thing in Franklin's time. It's not until the very end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, where people start to have ideas about the divergence of science and technology becoming different sorts of fields. And part of science at that time, it was not considered separate, but part and parcel of science was medicine. And the colonies obviously began in the earlier part of the 17th century, the 1600s, but believe it or not, it took until the middle part of the 18th century for the first real hospital to be founded in the colonies. This seems absurd, but it is true. Franklin is, along with several physicians, is the founder of Pennsylvania Hospital. He cared deeply for the health and welfare of society. And there's a phrase that was used over and over and over and over again during this time period. It started really in the 17th century, and even the very end of the 16th century. You hear variations of this idea, and it is a gendered quote, I know, for the greatest benefit of mankind. And obviously, we would think of it as the greatest benefit of humankind. People were not so stupid and narrow-minded that they thought that without women, the human race could carry on. They obviously knew that. But it was for the greatest benefit of mankind. And Franklin, like many other Enlightenment thinkers, latched onto this idea. And he not only thought about it, he really worked toward it. He spent a long time trying to make things better for people. Very, very important idea. Now, if you think back to that famous portrait of Franklin that appears, the face of which appears on our $100 bill, that doesn't look like a guy who is concerned with much of anything, except maybe not sitting anymore for this portrait. If you look at the David Martin portrait, of course, here you have someone who is doing nothing but contemplating and thinking and reading and learning. And of course, because that portrait comes after Franklin has done all this stuff, it is a reminder to people at the time, to contemporary viewers, that here's Benjamin Franklin. They all would have known that he did all this stuff. It was not any sort of like far-reaching idea, like, who's that? Everyone knew. Everyone knew what Franklin had done. So this idea of a hospital, big news. Now here's that pesky postmaster of the colonies thing again. This shows up in Franklin's career as a pivotal idea. And so how is this connected to science and technology? Franklin was part of a scientific circle. And it is through Franklin's ability to move the mail that scientific communication exploded in the mid-18th century, because every piece of mail that would pass through him would travel for free. The recipients of letters, who were responsible for paying the postage, everything came postage due in the 18th century. But if it had Franklin's official seal on it, it traveled for free. Thousands, not hundreds, thousands of pieces of mail and that had to do with science passed through Franklin's hands. And they all traveled for free. Now, it was a perk of the job. There was never any question from the British government, why is all this mail traveling for free? If it went before Franklin, he had the right to do this. This was a perk of his job. So communication exploded because of this. So it is definitely connected to science. Getting back to how Franklin made people's lives better, one of the very first things he did was he took an object, what was known as the Pennsylvania stove, and he made improvements to it. He made improvements to its design that its efficiency increased between, you'll hear some estimates of 80%, but conservatively, let's say 60%. He made these vast improvements to the Pennsylvania stove. We call it the Franklin stove now. He did not invent this stove. He just made a few modifications that made the thing super efficient. And why this is so important was wood was outrageously expensive, fuel for the stove. And by making it more efficient, required less fuel. Where this really came into play was, of course, in the northern colonies where it got relatively chilly, but also in northern Europe where it got very, very cold. And within the first month of Franklin's pamphlet describing the modifications to the Pennsylvania stove being released, the pamphlet was translated into 4 European languages. That's pretty amazing. It was huge that Franklin did this. And Franklin, of course, had many, many inventions and modifications of existing products, but again, we're on some time constraints, so I can't possibly not talk about the lightning rod and electricity. And Franklin, of course, did not discover electricity. many of us, myself included, learned history, what I call the kind of World Book Encyclopedia version of history, where they have to condense things so much to fit into column inches that it basically becomes a game of whispering down the lane or telephone, depending on where you're from. So we have these kind of compaction, this compaction of historical narrative. And it comes out in this compaction that Franklin discovered electricity, which of course he did not. But he did discover, of course, that lightning is electricity. And to that end, he understood implicitly, like everyone else around him, that lightning started lots of fires. Most structures were built of wood and caught fire very easily from lightning strikes. And so Franklin invented something that nobody else had done before. He understood that if you send the charge into the ground from a high point, no harm, no foul. And so he invents the lightning rod, which would have made him probably more money. The design for the lightning rod probably would have made him more money than his newspaper business, because the lightning rod was adapted everywhere. Franklin becomes a superhero of sorts. This is truly what makes him an international superstar. In France, he becomes the biggest thing. The only person that eclipses Franklin in France ever, who is not French, is Jerry Lewis. That's it. Jerry Lewis, of course, huge in France. Franklin was gigantic. If you were to walk the streets of 18th century Paris after Franklin's lightning rod had been invented, you would have seen lightning rods on every building. This was a big, big deal. Now, let's get back to art. Probably the most famous image of Benjamin Franklin and lightning. Benjamin West's little portrait, Benjamin Franklin drawing electricity from the sky. Now I want you to note the size of this. It's basically 14 by 10. Think about many of the picture frames you have hanging in your house that are probably 14 by 11, somewhere in there. That's the size of this Benjamin West piece from 1816. Benjamin West was certainly not known for painting little things like this. This is more like Benjamin West. His most famous painting, The Death of General Wolfe, which is for those of you who study art, even a little bit, probably understand that it's an allegory of the lamentation of Christ sort of scene, where the dying body of Christ is being held by Mary, and you have this. This is really the same scene, but this image, if you look at the size of it, it's basically 6 feet by 7 feet. And this is not even the largest of what Benjamin West produced. Not even close. There are a couple pieces hanging at PAFA that are just 3 times the size of this and take up entire gallery walls. They're amazing. I figured I'd use this image since many people have already seen it. So the Franklin image, allegedly, I say allegedly because we don't know for sure, but was supposed to be part of a much larger scale painting, kind of along the lines of The Death of General Wolfe. But this was a standalone piece. It was not a study. This was a standalone piece. And It was painted in around 1816. Franklin died in 1790, so it was painted much later. West, and one of the reasons that I bring this image up is not because of the subject matter. Franklin with the key, and you can see the kite string. You can't see the kite. There's the lightning in the background, and there's some little figures here playing with electrical apparatus down in the kind of lower left quadrant. This is a very iconic image, but it has some other facets that we don't think about. Let's look at Franklin here. This is a Franklin probably in his 70s. He's probably in his 70s. The Franklin of this experiment, and by the way, this, as Franklin describes it in the autobiography, this is not exactly what happens. Franklin actually sends his son William out to go capture the lightning while he stays safely on the sidelines. You know, kind of a sort of hold my beer sort of situation. So Franklin here appears much older than when this experiment would have been conducted in the late 1740s. Franklin was in his 40s at the time. But West, who actually knew Franklin, because Franklin lived in London for a long time, paints this because there had been so many images of the elder Franklin, the one from the 1785 portrait that we saw at the beginning, that show the older Franklin. But here West is saying, okay, here is the old wise Franklin, but I want to remind you of all this stuff he did with science. I want to do this, and I'm gonna kind of make a history painting, which is what West did, and give you these kind of elements as a tribute to Benjamin Franklin. Now, West and Franklin have a lot in common. Benjamin West was born just outside of Philadelphia in Swarthmore, immigrates to Britain, and never comes back. He is indeed American, and geographically American by birth. He's a British citizen, of course, because he's born in 1738, but he is geographically from America. He goes on to have, of course, this mammoth art career, and he becomes the second president of the Royal Academy. He succeeds Joshua Reynolds, the famous British painter. So Benjamin West is a force to be reckoned with. He never returns to America, either to the British colonies or to the United States. And this is kind of important because here's the tie to Franklin. Franklin has been referred to as the first American. Doing my best to hold back, I will just go, ha! Franklin, more than anything, saw himself as a British citizen. He loved being British. This was his thing. And we see him as a founding father, but there are many sorts of narratives that kind of come together that lead Franklin to side with the Patriots in what becomes the War of Independence. There are a lot of things that come together, and Franklin doesn't get to that point until 1773, 1774, and if 1775, Lexington and Concord, is kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? Franklin is very late to the party. Franklin loved being British. He spent 12 years outside the British colonies. 12 very important, 12 major years in 2 different stints. The first time was from 1757 to 1764, or sorry, 1762, and then from 1766 until 1775. Franklin is away for a long time. He's absent from the colonies for so long that the British government takes away his postmastership in the 1760s because they say he's derelict of his duties because he's living in Britain the whole time. So that'll give you an idea. Franklin loved being British. He has a residence in London. The only home that Benjamin Franklin lived in that's still standing is one that you can visit in London. Here in Philadelphia, there's the site of Franklin's house on Market Street. But this is a big deal. Franklin loved being British, and he even goes so far in 1773 and 4 to try to stop the possibility of a war between the colonies and the motherland. And obviously that did not happen. But Franklin, just like Benjamin West, sees himself as a British citizen. So very important to think about that in the context of how you view Franklin. Do you view him as a founding father? Well, of course we do. Franklin retires at age 42, and the rest of his life, for the next 42 years, he is just committed to civic duty. He retires completely, he withdraws from business. For about the next 3 or 4 years, he's still getting residual checks, as it were, from his printing business. But after that, he has more money than he knows what to do with. And he's giving back. He spends half of his life giving back. And these last 3 things are crucially important. He's the signer of the Declaration of Independence, which starts the whole idea of separation. He signs the Treaty of Paris that officially ends the War of Independence, and he also is a signer of the US Constitution. One thing that is crucial, and this makes him in many ways the ultimate founding father, his is the only name on the 3 most important documents that form the United States. He's the only one that signed all 3. So clearly, once he made the leap to the Patriot side, he was entrenched. So yes, he is the ultimate founding father. Is Franklin problematic? Of course, because like the rest of us, he was flesh and blood, a human being, and nobody is perfect. Is it abhorrent that he held slaves? Of course it is. When people around him, even earlier on, were saying, Benny, this is not such a great idea. But he did it anyway. Was he a womanizer? We didn't even talk about that. Yes, he was. And of course, he missed his wife's funeral. Didn't even make an effort to get back. Again, another story for another day. But just want to wrap up with a few images of Benjamin Franklin. Now, of course, the one in the bottom right here, How to Draw Benjamin Franklin, I thought was just apropos since we're talking about art. I think that's just great. It's actually a book on how to draw Benjamin Franklin. Let's talk about these other three things, though. We'll start with the upper left, Benjamin Franklin Plumbing, which is a franchise business. There are Benjamin Franklin plumbing franchises all over the US. Interestingly enough, Franklin had his hands in heating and electricity, but not plumbing. This was not one of the things one of the items he fooled around with. So that's just irony. I do love their logo, though, with Franklin holding the wrench. But he would have wholeheartedly approved of Ben Franklin Transit. Notice I found an image, all electric transit bus. That speaks for itself. But Ben Franklin Transit has nothing to do with Benjamin Franklin in the slightest. Ben Franklin Transit is the transit system in Tri-Cities, Washington, Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco, that area in Southeast Washington. And it is at the intersection, the three cities are housed in Benton County and Franklin County. So they got very clever and called it Ben Franklin Transit. I think that's just brilliant. Been around for quite a while, but they moved to all electric buses. So I found that image. And in the upper right, Ben Franklin, the 5 and 10 stores. Franklin would have been all over this. He would have been all over this because Ben Franklin stores are 5 and dimes, arts and crafts stores, framing stores, still exist today all over the country. They are all franchises. And Franklin, who essentially winds up franchising the Pennsylvania Gazette, would have loved this. He would have, and of course, the idea of the 5 and 10 goes back to Franklin's penny saved is a penny earned. And I just want to say thank you to all of you for coming out such that it is for this. And we'll open it up for questions. And I want to leave you with one last image, and I'll give you a few seconds to kind of take it all in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that. It's wonderful. Like you just mentioned, we do have a little bit of time for questions. So if you have them, feel free to drop them in the chat here. I put a few links already to Dr. Sivitz's course that's going to be starting next week, as well as I'll drop one to our YouTube channel before we end. But we have about 10 minutes, so if people want to drop in chats, we've already got a great one here from Sally. I had one that's similar to something I was thinking about. So Sally is new to learning about Benjamin Franklin and asked if you have any books about him that you'd recommend that are readable. That's a good decision.
Yes, well, one of my favorites, one of my very favorites, and I really like this one a lot, is called Runaway America by David Waldstreicher, who used to teach at Temple University. And it's about, it has the elements that you need to understand Franklin in context. And it talks about Franklin and slavery quite a lot. As part of this context, I think, and good stuff about Franklin as a printer as well. I really like Runaway America, and then there's also, and that's still in print, one that you're going to have to search for is an exhibition catalog from something that was put on at the Smithsonian a whole bunch of years ago now. Benjamin Franklin and his friends portraying the man of science in 18th century America, I think is the name of the text. Brandon Brame, I believe, is the author, and it's essentially an exhibition catalog, but with lots and lots of essays in it. Really great text, And you learn a lot about Franklin, and there's of course loads and loads of images and portraiture, so kind of connected to what my course is going to do. A little bit less history, more art focused. And the other thing I can tell you, if you want to read Franklin in his own words, but you want to make sure that you're not getting the Franklinized version completely, because again, his favorite subject was himself, is if you get the Yale University Press edition of the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin and you read the accompanying notes, you'll understand what Franklin is talking about, but then you will see them in an historical context. So those are three good ways into Franklin.
Thank you so much. That's great. I dropped 2 of those in the chat, and the other one you just mentioned, the autobiography, but the Yale version of notes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sally, for that question. I got a private question from Jay asking if you've run across any evidence that the Benjamin Franklin's drawing Electricity from the Sky was a study for a larger final version that West intended to donate to the Pennsylvania hospital. The evidence points to that. Yeah, it was supposed, again, this idea that you have one of these sort of big tribute paintings to hang in an institution of its founder makes a lot of sense. And logic kind of dictates that's probably the case, but I think this is not the amount of, I'm going to get in trouble here from the art community. I'm not an artist, but the amount of detail that's in this study and the execution of it makes it seem like, yes, he's going to use this as the basis for a larger painting, but this was not something that was just going to be consigned to a pile in his own studio. That he, because where I'm going with this is if you look at the quote unquote studies by John Constable, his studies are virtually almost the same size as the finished paintings, which is remarkable. I mean, he really went to town when he did these studies of his landscapes, but you can tell that when you look at them, they don't have the same sort of attention to the finest detail. He clearly is using them for reference because he's capturing all the ideas that show up in the finished piece, but aren't necessarily there. This Franklin piece is so detailed. So I think it was probably, it functioned both ways. Nice, thank you. So I have a question for you too while we wait. We only have we have about 5 minutes, so if you have questions, please drop them in the chat and we'll get to them in a moment. But I was wondering, so with Franklin's legacy being so immense, from the inventions to all the things you mentioned, if he had a personal invention or contribution to society that he thought, or that he was the most proud of in a way, since there's just so much to think about if we have that evidence.
I would say that he was probably most proud of the fact that he never patented any of his inventions, that he gave the ideas away for free, including the Pennsylvania stove, everything he worked on, that Franklin holds no patents. He never applied for them. He just gave away these ideas for free. And I think that's what Franklin was probably most proud of. Again, this kind of greatest benefit of mankind sort of idea. I think that the idea that most of what he did on these kind of bigger scale ideas for stuff that would help people were practical, and that he liked the practicality of these things. But I think as a whole, I think his biggest pride was the fact that he was able to give them away.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And not what I would have expected. So I think we have Audrey. Are you raising your hand? I'm going to unmute you. There we go.
Thank you. You mentioned about the lightning experiments and what it all led to. Am I correct in understanding that he founded the first fire station also that's located in Philadelphia?
Oh, yes. Okay. I love talking about this. Yeah. Franklin kind of, he's responsible for firefighting, sort of, but he's actually really connected to fire insurance. Now, this
Yes.
This is really kind of freaky. So you got to think about this as a whole. Franklin invents the lightning rod, which protects against fires. He's also essentially attached to a fire company, and if you've been to Philadelphia, you can still see fire marks on houses, particularly in older parts of the city. Those fire marks said to the fire company, and they went on for well into the 20th century, yeah, but you can put the fire out here, we've paid our insurance. So Franklin, imagine, if you will, if Franklin had patented the lightning rod. Think about this. He would have made money from the sale of lightning rods, but he would also made money from people who refused to get them, but bought fire insurance. So he was safe on either side. Franklin was involved with ideas of putting out firefighting, fire insurance, sanitation. Unfortunately, his ideas for sanitation for the city of Philadelphia were not effected until after his death. So he didn't run into a lot of luck with that. But yes, he was very much involved with anything to do with buildings catching on fire.
Thanks, Audrey. So we have a question from Jeannie that just popped up a little bit ago, that was asking about the image and popular culture of Franklin developed through magazines, newspapers, prints, and also wanted to know if your class is going to delve into that at all too.
Oh, absolutely. Again, today was, to try to give some context to how we see Franklin. But that very first popular culture image that I showed, which is obviously very recent, Franklin on the $100 bill with the COVID mask. I mean, that's about as pop culture as you can get for immediate pop culture. Interestingly enough, Franklin in popular culture, this whole idea starts during Franklin's lifetime. That image that is on the $100 bill, remember, the original portrait was painted during his lifetime. And we're going to go through a whole bunch of images that utilize that idea to, and basically, okay, here's why this image has sunk in. So yes, we are going to talk about that. We're going to, the Benjamin Franklin plumbing, that little drawing with him holding the wrench, same image again. But if it was Franklin the inventor, we would have been talking about 30, 40 years earlier. But that's not how he's portrayed.
So we have I have time for one last question, and I think it's a great way to wrap it up. Someone wanted to know, Joe wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about the comic that you shared at the end. So your last slide.
Oh, okay. In the interest of full disclosure, as I was putting this together today, or for today, I ran into that image, I guess it was last week or so, and I thought, oh, this is the perfect way to end because I'm going to talk about Franklin as postmaster. It was the Franklin, but to get back to the historical context, Franklin, when he became postmaster in 1737, essentially revolutionized mail delivery in the northern colonies. Mail delivery went from weeks to days when he became postmaster. It was amazing. And in Franklin's time, when he was postmaster, believe it or not, a letter from Philadelphia to New York City got there quicker than it does today. If you sent a letter out from Philadelphia, it would get to its recipient quicker in Franklin's time. So yes, he revolutionized that, which is the whole point of the the whole point of the cartoon. And also he ran it. He didn't run it with a deficit, the Postal Service, even though it was government operated. So there's the quick and dirty answer to that.
Thank you. Thank you for a little more context. So it is time. We are going to wrap up. I did before. I want to say goodbye. I want to drop in quickly one more link to Dr. Sivitz's class, as well as I have a link to our YouTube channel. So this recording will be up in the next couple days. So if you know of anyone who missed it that would like to check it out, you just go to our YouTube channel. That's where that will be uploaded in a few days. And then I also want to put in a plug for next week's Art at Noon. I think Anna's still on the call, but we have a rescheduled Art at Noon lecture from a few weeks ago with our curator, Anna Marley. She's going to be talking about Peel, the Mastodon, and we have some wonderful partners with us from the Smithsonian for that as well. Sorry, I'm bungling my description, but there's a link to that Peel, Humboldt, and Mastodon talk that's going to be next Wednesday, so please check that out. I wanted to, of course, thank Dr. Paul Sivitz for being here and sharing that wonderful lecture on Benjamin Franklin, and thank you all for being here with us this afternoon. So feel free to unmute yourself and say goodbye on your way out. We love to hear you say goodbye, but take
Hi,
care.
everyone.
Bye.
See you next week.
Bye.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, you're welcome. See you next week too. I'll certainly be tuning into that.
Oh, great. Yeah, we're going to have somebody from Germany, the head of the Darmstadt Museum, and Eleanor Harvey from the Smithsonian. So
Awesome.
it's going to be
Yeah.
a mammothly entertaining lecture.
Right, very good. Yes, I used to teach part of a lecture on the Peel in his museum painting. So that's I love that.
Bye.
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 Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Hi, Paul. Thanks so much.
Bye. Yeah.